Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for the inaugural presentation of the Tufts Faculty Webinar Series. This series is a new initiative being launched by the Tufts University Alumni Association to provide continuing education to our alumni around the world. We will be offering 5 one-hour live webinars throughout the academic year on relevant topics delivered by some of the most dynamic faculty on campus. For all of our attendees, your audio has been turned off, so if you would like to ask any questions, please type them into the chat box in the lower right of your screen. If there are any questions that go unaddressed before our stop time, then we will follow up with an email. This is a reminder that we are recording today's webinar, and we will post an on-demand version on the alumni website shortly. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Zarin Machanda, who will be discussing chimpanzee behavior and the evolution of human warfare.
Thank you so much, Joda. It is my pleasure to be here for the inaugural webinar series for the faculty. And as Joda said, today I'm going to talk to you about what chimpanzees can tell us a little about human warfare. So just to introduce myself a little bit more, my name is Dr. Zarin Machanda. I am a professor in the Department of Anthropology with a secondary appointment in the Department of Biology. And if you ever want to email or if you have further questions after today, please feel free to send me an email. I've included my email address on this slide. And in short, I'm a primatologist. So I'm a type of biologist who studies primates, and in particular, I study wild chimpanzees. And I've spent almost about 15 years studying wild chimpanzees, and before that, I worked with a group of captive chimps. And the reason that I am in a department of anthropology is because chimpanzees can tell us a lot about humans, since they are our closest living relative. So along with being a professor here at Tufts, I am also one of the directors of the Kibale Chimpanzee project, and this is a long-term research site in southwestern Uganda. We've been studying the same group of chimpanzees called the Kanyawara community that live in Kibale National Park, Uganda. I'm also one of the directors of a program called the Kasisi Project, and this is a community development and conservation project. I'm not going to tell you too much about this today, but if you tune into the next webinar, which is on December 7th, I'm going to talk a lot more about conservation and some of the work we do with the Kasisi Project. But for today, the big question that we want to ask is one that has been going on for hundreds of years, really trying to understand the nature of humans and trying to maybe pose this question as kind of a dichotomy between whether or not we are species that is naturally aggressive or naturally peaceful. And this debate goes back well into the 18th and 19th century when we had philosophers like Hobbes who believed that humans were naturally aggressive, countering the French philosopher Rousseau, who thought that the state of humanity was one that was naturally peaceful and that aggression is something that we developed through our lifetime. So we don't start life as an aggressive being. And what I'm going to do as both a biological anthropologist and a primatologist is use data from our closest living ancestor, chimpanzees, to try to understand this question and to try to put humans in more of a biological perspective. And so in order to do that, we actually have to understand a little bit about the evolutionary history of our species. And so if we look at what we call a phylogeny, this is how animals, how species are related to one another in kind of an evolutionary perspective. I'm sure as many of you know, we are very closely related to all of the great apes. In fact, we are one of the great apes. And our closest living relative is the chimpanzee. So you can see on this tree that we are actually, even though chimpanzees and this species called bonobos look a lot more like gorillas than they do like us, we actually share much more genetic material in common with chimpanzees than they do with gorillas. So we share about 98.6 or 98.7% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos, making them our closest living relative. So just to put this into perspective, what we have here on this phylogeny or this evolutionary tree is that we have two groups of apes, one that live in Asia, which are the orangutans and gibbons, and then a group that live in Africa, and we are one of these African apes. And then, like I said, we also have a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos, which means that about 5 to 7 million years ago, there was a species that lived on Earth that was probably very much like a chimpanzee, looked like a chimpanzee in that it was kind of larger bodied, about 50 kilos, black-haired, walked on 4 legs, and that eventually split into these two lineages, one that became us and one that became bonobos and chimpanzees. So for those of you who are not as familiar with chimpanzees, they live in equatorial Africa, and they show kind of moderate sexual dimorphism, meaning that the males are slightly bigger than the females. Males will weigh in at about 50 kilos, about 120 pounds or so. Females about 40 kilos, so there's about a 20% size difference between males and females. And they live in tropical lowland forests and sometimes woodland. So essentially these are species that are relegated to tropical forests in equatorial Africa. Now I've mentioned this other species a few times called the bonobo, and not everyone has heard of these, but bonobos actually share just as much DNA with humans as chimps. So the split between chimpanzees and bonobos came after the split between chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. So this is also one of our closest living relatives on Earth with chimpanzees. And they're a really interesting species. If you look back to the chimps and you kind of look at their body structure, one of the things that you'll notice about bonobos is that they're a little bit more what we call gracile, or a little bit thinner. So they tend to be kind of skinnier. They actually have smaller heads on their bodies than chimpanzees. And for reasons that I don't understand, they all have middle parts, and their faces are quite a bit darker than chimpanzees, and they have these bright pink lips. Now, some of you will have heard of bonobos, and they're often referred to as the make love, not war ape. And the reason for this is that where chimpanzees will solve almost all of their problems by fighting with each other and attacking each other, bonobos solve almost all of their problems by having sex with each other. So even before sharing food or something like that, they'll have sex with each other, reduce the tension in the group, and everyone is pretty happy about that. So as I said, chimpanzees and actually all of the African apes, including bonobos and gorillas, are found in equatorial Africa. For chimpanzees, whose genus and species name is Pan troglodytes, we recognize 4 subspecies of chimpanzees. There is, as you can see in yellow here, a group that lives in Western Africa, subspecies in West Africa. The purple and green are the subspecies that represent Central African chimps. And then in blue, we have the East African chimps, and that's where I work in a country called Uganda, which is essentially where you see kind of the easternmost range of those eastern chimpanzees. And these are the subspecies that are probably the best known to most people. This is the subspecies, for example, that Jane Goodall studied. And what you see in red here is the territory of bonobos, which are pan-paniscus, so a completely different species. And their geographic range does not overlap with chimpanzees at all. So they are not living in the same forest. And actually, they are completely geographically separated, and you can see kind of in the north part of that red blob and going to the east, kind of a white, like a separation between those East African chimps. And what that is a geographic boundary, which is the Congo River, which is actually fairly wide, and chimpanzees and bonobos don't swim, so they are geographically separated. So there's no gene flow between chimpanzees and bonobos. So let me tell you, I'm not going to talk as much about bonobos just right now. Just keep in mind that in general, as we go through this talk, what we know less about bonobo behavior. They're a little bit harder to study because they're in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has had numerous civil wars over the last few decades. But in general, the way we think about bonobos is that they are less aggressive than chimpanzees. So something I will come back to. But remember them as that make love, not war ape. So let me tell you a little bit more about chimps. Chimpanzee diets are fairly diverse. They are what we would call omnivores. So the majority of their diet consists of eating ripe fruit. Just keep in mind, so it's like 60% of their diet is ripe fruit, but keep in mind that we're talking about wild fruit. So it's not like they have access to mangoes and pineapples and all of that really, really sweet kind of fruit that we think about. Wild fruit tends to have about as much sugar as carrots. So that's what a wild fruit would taste like, but it's still their preferred food. It's still what they like to eat. They'll go out of their way to find it. When there's not that much ripe fruit available, they'll supplement their diet with things like young leaves, maybe pith, which is kind of like bamboo, flowers, and then occasionally they do like to eat some animal protein, which in some cases will take the form of insects, and in many other cases, chimpanzees will hunt and kill monkeys that live in their habitat, especially red colobus monkeys like the ones pictured here, and they will maybe about 10 to 15% of their diet will consist of animal protein. So they are omnivores and they do eat meat, and that tends to surprise a lot of people about chimps. This is just a little fun fact more about chimps, but one of the things that we have done is a couple of studies where we have looked at feeding time versus body weight. And what we find here on the x-axis is a measure of body weight for many, many primates, about 80 different species of primates. And then on the y-axis, how much time they spend feeding. And what you see in general is that the bigger the primate, the more time they spent feeding. And chimps, which are pantroglodytes, fall really nicely on this line. And essentially what this means is that about 50% of their day is spent chewing. So not just looking for food or traveling to find food, but actually chewing. So that's about 6 hours of their day. Now, you can actually also see the greatest outlier on this graph is Homo sapiens, or humans, who spend between 5 to 10% of their day chewing their food. And you can do this, an experiment on yourself. It ends up being about half an hour to about an hour a day that you actually spend chewing. So chimpanzees are incredibly motivated by food. It's something that takes up a lot of their time, thinking about food, looking for food, chewing their food. It's one of the things that they are kind of obsessed with. And I was in the field once, and the chimps had gone into a village and raided a mango tree. And if most of your food tastes like carrots, you can imagine mangoes are pretty amazing. And I once saw a chimp eat 56 mangoes in an hour. That's how motivated they are to eat food. So chimpanzees spend a lot of time in big fruit trees in their forest, and I wanted to share with you one of the videos that we took at our field site. Let me just say two things about these videos. The videos that I'm going to show you in this presentation were all taken by Ronan Donovan, who is an exceptional wildlife photographer, and I'd encourage you to check out the rest of his work. And there are going to be some videos and pictures in this presentation that might make you a little bit uncomfortable because we are talking about aggression, and I'll definitely give you a warning before we show any of those. But what I'm going to show you now is a video that Ronan took from a feeding tree at Kanyawara. This is probably about 30 meters up into the canopy of a tropical rainforest. And you'll see some nice social interactions, but also this will give you a sense of what the forest looks like. And we're really privileged at Kanyawara at my field site where the chimps are comfortable enough with humans, they really don't seem to mind us, that we're actually able to spend time in trees with them. So let me show you this video. So what you see here is our alpha males right in the middle of the screen. And he moved towards that younger male who then gave a submissive vocalization towards the alpha male. But we also have some females, and in the distance you can actually see some babies. But this is pretty much what chimps spend about 6 hours of their day doing. And you can hear some of the lovely other wildlife in the background, some of the birds. So hopefully that got you in the spirit of, sorry, let me go back to sharing my screen. Sorry, thank you. Sorry, we're just a little technical difficulty while I'm sorting this out. Okay, so hopefully that got you a little bit in the mood of what it's like to study wild chimpanzees. Let me continue to tell you a little bit more about how they live. Chimpanzees have a very interesting social organization pattern for a primate. So chimpanzees live in a group that we call a community. And a community is made up of adult males, adult females, and all of the babies of the females. And communities on average are about 50 individuals. Right now, I think our Kanyawara is about 58 individuals. But they can be small, they can be just about 30, sometimes even fewer than that, up to 200, 250 individuals. Now, the interesting thing about the community is that even though we have 58 chimpanzees in our community, and they have a very specific community range or territory, we never actually see all of the community members together at one time. Now, this is very different from other primates where a troop or one group of individuals will always be together. So they'll travel together, they'll sleep together, they'll move around and feed together. Chimpanzees, on the other hand, have what we call a fission-fusion social system. And so within the community range, what you see are individuals are scattered throughout. And sometimes we see groupings of many individuals that you can see here in the boxes. And these are what we would call parties. Any kind of group of chimpanzees that we come across in our chimp territory is going to be called a party. And sometimes parties can be big, especially when there are females who are ovulating. The males are very attracted to them. Those are the ones in red here. But in general, what we see, a common pattern is that males are often in parties with each other, much more so than females. And females tend to be more solitary and in parties just with their dependent offspring. So the reason that we call these fission-fusion grouping is that the parties are not permanent groupings. These are temporary subgroups that can change throughout the day. So in many ways, I like to think of this just in the same way that humans are fission-fusion. So very few of us spend, at the end of this presentation, you might get up and go somewhere and join another group of individuals, and you might stay with them for an hour and then go and join another group of individuals before you go home for the night. So each time you end up leaving one group and joining another is called a fission-fusion event. And that's what chimpanzees are like too. So we might start the day with a party with the chimpanzees in this kind of social pattern that I'm showing here. But towards the end of the day, it might shift towards something like this, where we actually have individuals who've come and gone and left these parties and joined others. But the important thing is that they are in a territory, they all know each other, and they all do end up seeing each other throughout the year, but they might go days or months without seeing particular individuals. So, as I mentioned, one of the things that we'll notice about chimpanzee grouping is that males tend to be more social than females. So what you see on this graph is some data from our long-term field site on differences in how the different sexes associate with one another. So on the y-axis, we have an association value. And what I think is pretty obvious from this is that males tend to spend more time in parties with other males, and females are the least social, so they're the least likely to be in parties with other females. And then the males and females are kind of intermediate with each other. But it's more than just who they spend time in parties with. When males are in those parties, they like to sit next to each other. So that's what that proximity measure is. And females are less likely to sit next to each other when they're in parties together. And then finally, males are much more likely to groom each other when they are sitting next to each other than females. So, and that's a really striking difference. In fact, when we did this study, we used almost something like 15 years of data, and we only really had just over 30 female-female grooming bouts. compared to about 2,000 for males. So males were much, much more likely to engage in that kind of social behavior with each other. So that suggests that there are differences in the strategies that males and females use in chimpanzees. Now, one of the reasons that we think females are less social than males is that they're not actually in groups with their relatives. So in the life of a female chimpanzee, she's born into a community, and then between the age of about 12 to 14, she will actually disperse to a new community. And this is a way that chimpanzees can avoid inbreeding. So even though she spent about a dozen years in this group and knows all the individuals and has her mother and siblings in this group with her, she actually will then travel through the forest to a neighboring community, and maybe not necessarily the next door community, maybe a couple over. And so that means every so often, even at our field site, we stop seeing some of our adolescent female chimps, and then we may never see them again. And we'll end up getting these stranger females who are about 13 years old who come and join our group. Now, that may be one reason that females are less social, because they're not in groups with their kin. But they are, in general, just relatively solitary. And this is a map from the Gombe field site, which is where Jane Goodall started doing her work. And what we find at numerous chimpanzee field sites is that females actually will have these kind of core areas within a chimpanzee community range or territory, and that's where we're more likely to find them. And they tend to kind of, in those community range, some of them overlap, but many of them don't. And it's kind of like their little area of that field site that they like to hang around in. Or you may even call them kind of like a neighborhood. Males, on the other hand, kind of are ranging all over the whole community range. And I do want to just introduce one of our newest female chimps who has come into the community in the last year, is named Jumbo. She's named obviously after the Tufts mascot. She's still a little bit shy, but we actually do think she has actually joined the community. We've seen her for the last year now, and she's even started having mating with the males in our group, so we will expect a baby from Jumbo in the next few months, and we'll have to come up with some Tufts-related baby names. So if you have any ideas, please let me know. Males are slightly different than females, which is true probably of most animals. But male strategies tend to revolve around competing for dominance rank. So there is a lot of aggression within the group in chimpanzees as males fight for being high-ranking. So we have an alpha male and a beta male, and a number 3 and 4 and 5. And the reason that it is important for males to fight for high rank is that high-ranking males have more babies. So this is, again, data from Gombe, which is Jane Goodall's site, but this is true at every chimpanzee field site. You'll see that for the most part, the alpha male gets a lot of the conceptions, so meaning that he's the father of a lot of the babies. Or at least high-ranking males get a lot of the conceptions or sire a lot of the babies. And at any given field site, it's probably about 30% of the babies are fathered by the alpha male, and probably over 50% are sired by either the alpha or high-ranking male. So in terms of evolution and thinking about evolution as reproductive success or striving for reproductive success, it is good to be a high-ranking male chimp. So how do chimpanzees compete for dominance rank? Well, one of the things that you'll see often on a daily basis is chimpanzees will do dominance displays towards each other. So let me show you what these displays look like. So here are 4 male chimps displaying, and they are dragging branches, and they've puffed their hair up to make them look bigger. It's going to be a little chaotic as the other ones run by. They're just generally causing havoc and trying to look very imposing. And what you hear above them are the other chimps in the party indicating that they are, in fact, somewhat intimidated by these male chimps. And before you think that that might not be so impressive, let me just tell you that chimpanzee males, or actually chimpanzees in general, are incredibly strong animals. They can lift between 500 and 800 pounds with one arm. So although you may not think it's that impressive to see a chimpanzee running towards you dragging a branch, that's something that we would worry about, because I know that if they throw that branch at me, it's going to hurt a lot. So that is a way, kind of on a daily basis, that male chimps assert their dominance over other members of their group. And some of those displays will actually turn into outright aggression, where two individuals will fight each other. That's less common, but certainly happens. And when we are trying to figure out who the dominant male is, one of the things that we look for is who wins those fights. Another thing that we'll look for is a vocal behavior, which is called a pant grunt or a pant bark. And these are given as signals of subordinacy from a low-ranking individual to a high-ranking individual. So if you are a low-ranking individual and a high-ranking individual comes towards you, or vice versa, one of the things that you are expected to do in chimpanzee society is give a signal of that subordinacy, which is a vocal signal called a pant grunt. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. In this next video, what you're going to see is a chimp named Kakama, who at the time this video was taken was the alpha male. And he's going to walk past another chimp named Tuber, who is an adolescent male. And you'll hear Tuber kind of giving a very emphatic pant bark, which signals that he is not dominant to Kakama, and he knows that Kakama is dominant to him. So that was Tuber's pant bark towards Kakama. So that's how we assess male dominance. And so generally the idea here is that males within the group are very competitive with one another, and a lot of that competition will turn into aggression. But males have a dual strategy, because not only males are also very social with each other, as I've shown you. And one of the reasons for that we believe males to be more social is that they are the philopatric sex. And by philopatry, what we mean is that they are the sex that stays in the group that they're born into. So whereas female chimpanzees will disperse at adolescence, male chimpanzees will they are born in a community and they'll die in that same community. And essentially what that means is that they're in groups with their kin. They get to be in groups with their brothers and fathers and uncles. And that relationship, that genetic relationship, is what we think also kind of solidifies that more cooperative spirit that we see among male chimpanzees as well. And we do see a lot of cooperation. I've already shown you that they like to spend time with each other and groom each other, but they also will form coalitions with each other. So two chimps will form kind of a partnership to be aggressive towards another chimp. They're more likely to share food with one another. And importantly for this talk, they are often patrolling the territory of their home range. So what you'll find is that they are very territorial. Chimpanzees are incredibly xenophobic, and they do not like strangers. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later. And every so often, it depends on which field site, the males in particular will form a group, and in single file, they'll head down to the kind of border zone of their territory, which is a dangerous place to be, and together they will patrol, which is to basically walk along this invisible border to make sure that everything is okay with their neighbors and their neighbors haven't intruded. And that's the kind of behavior that we call cooperative, because you really have to trust that the other chimps with you are not gonna run away if the going gets tough. So male chimpanzees have this incredibly kind of this double life where they are both aggressive to one another within their group, but also fairly cooperative with one another within their group as well. So they have these kind of interesting, this interesting dichotomy between those two strategies. So when we're watching male chimpanzees, it's not uncommon to see a lot of grooming behavior, as I'm going to show you here. these are two of our males. On the left, you'll see Kakama, who's the alpha male. On the right, you'll see Makoku, who is actually a good buddy of Kakama. So we know from our data that they actually have quite a strong bond with one another. And here they're grooming each other, which we believe is a way that they are solidifying their bond for one another. Not only is it a way to keep themselves clean and reduce their stress, but this is also a way of them showing that they actually do have a strong social bond. So grooming is a way that we will determine affiliative strength, but remember that they have this kind of dual life. And one of the things that we note about chimpanzees in particular is that they do exhibit high rates of within-group aggression. So I told you that this is one of the ways that they assert dominance over one another. So it's common to see two males fight each other. What I'm going to show you here is going to include some male-male aggression, but also you're going to see how males treat some of the adult females in their group. And so this video can be a little bit difficult to watch, just as a warning, because you're going to see a female chimp get aggressed upon by at least two male chimps. And this is, so seeing aggression given from males to females is quite common. I will say that the degree of aggression that we see in this video is not something that we would see every single day, but it's not uncommon to see them fight each other like this. So let me show you what that video looks like. And what you're going to see to start off with is, I believe, Johnny is going to be aggressing against a female named Special, and then I'll narrate the rest as it's happening. So Special is the smaller chimp. That was Johnny just hitting her a few times. Now Makoku comes up, and he's going to start aggressing against her. First as a display, then some kicks and bites. Now he's just pushing her head into the ground with his foot. And now you'll actually see Johnny and Makoku start fighting each other. So these are two males who are engaged in aggression. Some hitting and biting. And now Special thinks she's okay. She's looking around, and kind of out of nowhere, Eslam comes, chases her up a tree, and then bites her on the shoulder and drags her out of the tree, and then chases her away. So this is where I mean that chimpanzees often solve a lot of their issues through aggression. So they fight for dominance. We see some kind of aggression almost on a daily basis. This would be very unusual for bonobos, where we tend to see them having sex to kind of dissipate any social tension that they have. So the photo on the next slide is going to be a little bit graphic. So it's going to show a dead chimpanzee, just as a warning. But as I mentioned, one of the male strategies that we have is not just about within group aggression, but between group aggression. So male chimpanzees do range quite widely in their territory. And as I mentioned, they cooperate to defend that range. And so not only that doesn't just include patrols, but if chimpanzees are on patrols, one of the things that we will see is if they come across individuals from the neighboring group, in some cases they will actually attack them and kill them. And in other cases, they will even go into the neighboring territory and seek out individuals from the neighboring group to kill. And this is this picture was taken by Martin Muller, who's one of my colleagues, who came across the dead body of this chimp who had been the victim of one of these kinds of attacks. And so all of the wounds that you see here are inflicted by other neighboring chimpanzees. So let's go into between group aggression, because that's really one of the things that we really want to think about with respect to humans and warfare. So when we think about between group aggression, the way that we have to envision primates living in a forest or living in a habitat is that the habitat is full of populations, or in the case of chimpanzees, it's full of different communities. And basically, a species will take up as much room as there is habitat. So in a large habitat, most groups, especially the ones in the middle, are going to be surrounded by other groups. And there's going to be competition for resources because resources are always scarce. So you're always facing some kind of competition from those around you. And between group aggression in primates and most mammals is a universal. And that's true even in those relatively peaceful species like bonobos. So yes, when two bonobo communities come together, you will often have these interesting non-hostile interactions where neighboring communities will just hang out. Sometimes you'll actually see them groom each other and have sex and play. That is never anything that we would see with chimpanzees, who are always going to have hostile interactions between groups. But even in the case of bonobos, who are, in many ways one of the most peaceful primate species on Earth, you still will routinely see hostile interactions between groups where both males and females participate, and they basically will just line up and scream at each other and kind of display at each other, and every so often this can even lead to wounds. So even in the most peaceful species, we will see between group aggression. So there are two types of aggression, and I've kind of hinted at that when I say that bonobos engage in battles and not raids. So let me just talk a little bit about the two types of aggression. So one type of aggression is what we would call the balance of power. Now, this is a situation where essentially when you have two sides, whether it's two individuals fighting each other or two groups fighting each other, where you have essentially an equal number of individuals on either side. And we characterize a balance of power aggression as kind of low level. It doesn't necessarily escalate to any sort of very intense aggression. And what happens in chimpanzees, this is what we would call a battle because there are multiple aggressors on each side. So if our chimpanzees are on patrol and they come across a neighboring community and they basically have around the same numbers, just say we have 10 chimps in our group and 10 in the other, what they'll do is they'll kind of display at each other. It might escalate to the point where one individual will run into the neighboring area and just kind of like display at particular individuals and then run back quickly. It would be dangerous because they're equally matched. If you fight, the chance of you getting hurt is probably pretty high. And so these are really more like, when we see this in chimps, we see the chimps kind of screaming at each other across this border zone, but eventually they'll just move apart from each other. And this is what we would call a battle. And in this case, both fighters survive. And my favorite example of this is actually lobsters, where two male lobsters will fight each other, and they'll use their crusher claws to engage in they just kind of grab their crusher claws and squeeze until one lets go. So I guess that's kind of like playing chicken. But they don't keep squeezing until they kill the other opponent. So it's equally matched on both sides. The other type of aggression that we see is what we call the imbalance of power. And in this case, the group that has the more individuals, or for whatever reason has the more fighting ability, doesn't feel inhibited because they're not afraid of pushing that aggression to its most intense. And because they have more individuals, they're going to win and most likely not be injured. So in an imbalance of power, this would be like if our chimpanzees went on a patrol and came across a single individual from the neighboring community. If that happens, they will begin with this intense, strong attack, and they don't need to stop. There's no risk of injury. And so they can keep fighting, and that intensity can build. Now, in this situation, it's not uncommon that victims can die, especially if the imbalance of power is quite large. And this is particularly rare in the animal world. So this is something that we see in chimpanzees, and it's also something that we see in humans. Now, the the type of aggression that the way we would describe this is we would call this a raid as opposed to a battle. And if the raid is kind of silent or secret, where the chimps are so quiet and they go into the neighboring territory to seek out a lone individual, we might call that a stealthy raid or a lethal raid. And here, I'm going to show you that same picture from that Martin Muller had taken, and it's a little bit gruesome. But here is, again, the body of a chimp who is the victim of one of these lethal raids. And when we see, these are rare events in a year if you're studying chimpanzees. You can go years without seeing this. So I don't want to paint the picture that they're constantly doing this. But certainly it is dangerous to be a chimpanzee who is alone, especially in the periphery of your community, because this can happen. And sometimes we have seen limbs ripped apart, heads ripped apart. It's not uncommon for these to be incredibly brutal attacks. And the important point here is that the attackers are never damaged. So you may see these kinds of wounds on the victim, but you're not going to see the attackers, the aggressors, have many wounds or any wounds at all. So let's talk a little bit more about this imbalance of power. Why do we see this in chimpanzees? Why is this so rare in the animal world? And the answer to that is, as I mentioned already, chimpanzees have that really unusual grouping pattern. So I'm not going to get into it today, but because of the way their food is distributed and the way that the types of food that they eat, what we find is that the environment, the ecology that chimpanzees live in, creates a situation of fission-fusion grouping. Now, if you think back to that graph that I showed you, remember that means that for our community, not all 58 chimpanzees are in the same place at the same time. And that creates a situation where you can have chimpanzees who are alone or are in parties of one or two individuals. And that's why we can, in the world of chimpanzees, get these imbalances of power, where a party of 10 individuals may come across a party of just one individual. That creates a situation of low-cost lethal aggression, right? Because we now have this imbalance of power. So the group that has 10 is going to feel that this is a low-cost, easy way to get rid of a rival from a neighboring group. And this is what will then lead to increased intergroup dominance. If you can slowly pick away at your rivals and get rid of them one by one, your group becomes more dominant. You can eventually take over some of that territory. And if you have access to more resources, then you also have access. If you have access to that other territory and more resources, that's going to draw more females into your group. And then you're going to have more access to mates. And for a male chimpanzee, that's a pretty good thing in terms of increasing your reproductive success. So let's actually test some of these hypotheses with data from our chimps. So the first is that we would predict that in an imbalance of power, when you have more individuals, you should actually see more between group aggression. So one of the ways, these are hard questions to test because I said this is a rare behavior, so we would be waiting 30, 40 years before we had enough data to actually do a meaningful statistical test. But we can putz it a little bit by actually doing in the wild what we call a playback experiment. What Mike Wilson did with his co-authors for this publication, and this was done at our field site of Kanyawara, is he played a call of a neighboring chimpanzee, or stranger chimpanzee, to a group of males. And he just looked at what they did. Now, if they are feeling kind of confident because they have that imbalance of power, you would expect them to approach the speaker at different rates depending on how many males are in the party. What you find is that the more males that are in the party that you're playing this call to, the more there are males, the more the probability of approaching the speaker increases. So if there's just one chimp in the party, he has a much lower chance of approaching the speaker than if there are 6 or 7 chimps in the party. So in that sense, you actually have this idea that power asymmetry will affect the probability of attacking. We also can do this from actual data where we have intergroup interactions, and what we see is that again on the x-axis we have number of males in the party, and on the y-axis we have intergroup interactions. And so what you notice is that there's an increase. So the more males that are present in a party, the more we see intergroup encounters. So again, we would expect this given this imbalance of power. Now, the other thing that we predicted would be, so not only that there would be an imbalance of power that leads to more attacks, but that we also said that if you could actually pick off your rivals, you would have access to more resources. You could increase your territory size. So this is data published by Zarin Machanda and colleagues from the Ngogo group of chimpanzees, which is also located in Kibale National Park, about 10 kilometers away from where I work. And this is a group that actually has exhibited a great deal of intergroup interactions and lethal aggressions over the last 20 years or so. And what you see in that dark gray is their territory range. And each of those dots with numbers is an event where the Ngogo chimps have killed a member of a neighboring group. And you can see it's actually quite concentrated, especially in the northeast part of their territory. They've killed more than 20 chimps of their neighbors. And what you see is where they have killed, especially in that northeast area, they've killed a lot there, that they've actually taken over that territory. And that's what that hash mark is. You can see that now their territory has expanded by almost 20%. And so that indicates that they actually have access to an increased number of resources because they've been able to take over that area. Now, what does that mean if you can take over an area? So you have access to resources. Well, this is data from Gombe by Williams et al. And what you see in red, the Gombe has three communities that are studied. The one in red, which is the main study group, is called Kasakela. And over about a decade, what the observers noticed is that the Kasakela community took over large chunks of area from both the northern and southern neighbors. So again, like the Ngogo chimps, they've expanded their home range. And over that same time, what's really interesting is that as their territory size increased, which is now I'm looking at the graph and showing how on the x-axis there's an increase in territory size, you actually see among the female chimpanzees a shortening of the interbirth interval. And the interbirth interval is the amount of time in days between female births. And so what's happening is as you're increasing your territory, you're increasing your resources. Female reproduction is going to be determined by access to resources. And so the increased food that these chimps were able to get by having more territory has translated essentially into more babies for those females. So you have increased reproductive success by doing this behavior, by killing your neighbors. You increase your territory and increase the number of genes that you put into the next generation. So this is why we talk about lethal aggression in chimpanzees as being adaptive. Okay, so that tells us a lot about chimps, but what on earth does this have to do with humans? And going back to our original question of whether chimpanzees are naturally aggressive or naturally peaceful. Well, let's look at what some anthropologists have written about this subject. This is something that even as Hobbes and Rousseau were debating it back in the 18th and 19th centuries, this is something that today people still debate. And so Douglas Fry has written a book that says, actually, yes, ancient human hunter-gatherers were incredibly peaceful, and humans have the potential for peace. Lawrence Keeley has written instead, no, ancient hunter-gatherers were not at all peaceful, and that idea of a peaceful the first humans being peaceful is entirely a myth. So the naturally peaceful view, Fry writes, one important general contribution that anthropology holds for ending the scourge of war lies in demonstrating that warfare is not a natural, inevitable part of human nature. I'll take exception to the fact that when we talk about something being natural, it does not necessarily mean it's inevitable. but just he is kind of talking about how this is not something that is part of human nature. And a lot of this work is based on ethnographies of particular groups around the world, including a group called the Semai, who live in Malaysia. And these are horticulturalists, so they do minimal agriculture, and they're made up of about 25,000 individuals. And many people have written about them that they may be the most peaceful society known to anthropology. So among the Semai, physical violence is extremely uncommon, as Robercheck and Robercheck write. Adults do not fight, husbands do not beat their wives, nor parents their children. Homicide is so rare as to be virtually absent. So this gives us some indication that there may be populations on Earth that are incredibly peaceful. So supporting this idea that humans are naturally peaceful. But I want to remind you that when we think about primates, essentially, and between group aggression, remember that everyone is surrounded by other individuals. And the argument that I'm going to make now is that whether or not you are aggressive will depend on who your neighbors are. And so a lot of recent studies have argued that there are some groups that have no violence or warfare, but the groups that have no warfare are all surrounded by neighbors that have more power than them. So these groups are also bounded by state-level societies. And the fact that they are peaceful may have more to do with who their neighbors are than any sort of internal peaceful nature. So if we think back to the Semai, when you read another ethnography by Denton, what the Semai themselves will say is, other people kill us. We don't kill other people. We never get so angry that we go to war. How could we? We lack the equipment. We are alone. Other peoples are many. It would be futile. So they cannot fight back. If you are a group surrounded by more powerful neighbors who in particular have weapons, it's not probably in your best interest to be particularly aggressive between groups because you're going to lose. And so in this case, we actually have an imbalance of power where their neighbors are much stronger and have more sophisticated weapons. So if you are a nomadic forager and you are surrounded by farmers, you are often politically weaker than those farmers. You often have no weapons. And this tends to lead to these peaceful encounters or peaceful societies. So that suggests that it's not that these foraging societies where we see these very peaceful interactions are internally peaceful. It actually tells us something about how warfare and aggression may be adapted to context. And if the Semai were surrounded by other foragers who were kind of politically and militarily on par with them, we would expect them to be as aggressive as any other group. And we can see this among other groups, other populations in the world, like the Andamanese Islanders who are off the coast of India. When you look at their structure of their societies, what you see is you have these tribes, tribal territories, and within tribes you have bands. The bands tend to be individuals who are related to each other and who have the same are part of the same linguistic group. Between bands, you actually have mostly peaceful interactions, although there are going to be some squabbles between bands. But between tribes, you have external war. And among the Andamanese, external war is unremitting and constitutes, as Kelly says, a condition of existence that defines the boundaries of niches exploited by two populations. Peace was unattainable. What I'm trying to point out here is that if you are a foraging group surrounded by another foraging group, as these Andamanese Islander tribes are, you are always going to be in a state of constant warfare, just like these chimpanzees as these chimpanzees find themselves in. Another example, the Eskimos who live up in the Arctic are another group of foragers surrounded by other foragers, and they again have networks which are made up of families. Each network has distinct languages and distinctive clothing, so you can look across your habitat and see someone approaching and know if they are in your network or not. And killing was just a constant response to strangers who were being seen. So if you saw someone who you didn't know, who you weren't expecting, and who wasn't speaking the right language or wearing the right clothing, they were assumed to be hostile and were then killed. Another example from a different part of the world, the Asmat people of Papua New Guinea. This is some nice data showing that they not only are aggressive between groups, but they also, that the type of aggression that we see are these raids instead of battles. What happens among the Asmat is that the raids start kind of at camp. You have festivities in camp. You solidify male alliances, just like chimpanzees groom each other, and then the men go off in silently before the light comes up in canoes to the neighboring territory. They try to get as many men as possible so that they can outnumber their neighboring group and actually just kind of find isolated individuals that they can kill. Sometimes they'll take hostages to kill independently. And in this kind of situation, there is a lot of excitement about killing. So as soon as you have a victim, you know, they have this ritual beheading procedure, but there is a lot of joy on the part of these men in terms of killing someone from their neighboring group. In the same, you know, and in some way we see this kind of social excitement that we in chimpanzees as well when they find a neighboring chimp that they kill. So it's really interesting because between group aggression it's aggression and it's very violent, but it does depend on cooperation. So your survival and your success depends on having a big group. So you have to trust that individuals are not going to run away as soon as you start your raid. And in other words, you have to trust that no one else will defect. So what is the benefit of this? Why is there such excitement? Why is this such a positive thing for so many people around the world? Well, in many ways, there are lots of benefits of participating in warfare. If you see the if the number of benefits from warfare, from participation of warfare increases, so this can be measured as how many tokens of success you get. Like, do you get kind of hot wives, all sorts of things that you can get from participating in warfare. You see that as the benefits increase, so does the number of kills, so does the mortality in warfare. So different societies around the world have differing levels of mortality due to warfare, and this is correlated with how much of a benefit that those men get. And from an evolutionary perspective, we also see that participating in a raid actually increases your reproductive success. So this is data from Luke Loacki and Richard Wrangham on the Nyangatam, who are a group of pastoralists in Ethiopia. And what they've done, what Luke has done here in particular is grouped men as either prolific raiders or non-prolific raiders. So men who often participate in these lethal stealth raids and those who don't. And the ones that participate often have more wives and they have more children. So again, from an evolutionary perspective, there is a great benefit of being someone who engages in warfare. So let's kind of think about humans more broadly. All around the world, whether you're a forager or a farmer, pastoralist, there are differing levels of warfare and in terms of the population killed per year. But what you see is, and that is actually true with chimpanzees as well, what you see here is that chimpanzees, farmers, pastoralists, and foragers exhibit essentially the same amount of warfare, the same degree of mortality due to warfare. And I'd like to point out that in green we have these industrial societies, and that first bar includes the 1900s, includes basically the industrialized world, Germany, Russia, France, Japan, and Sweden during World War I and World War II. So industrialized nations actually show less mortality due to warfare than any of the other kind of foraging groups that we see on Earth or chimpanzees. And so even our bloodiest time on Earth as living in an industrial society shows reduced warfare compared to foragers living on the planet. And so in many ways, our rates of intergroup aggression are really, really similar to chimpanzees. What about within group aggression? Well, that's where we start to see a slightly different pattern. What we have here is data from chimpanzees in terms of physical aggression for males and females. And we've done the same thing for a group of Australian Aborigines for which this data is available. And this is true pretty much across the board if you look at most societies in terms of within group aggression. And there's so little within group aggression in humans that it's almost, compared to chimps, that it's hard to put on the same plot. You really can't even see the human aggression. And so we have this interesting pattern where chimpanzees are 100 to 500 times more aggressive within their group than humans. So humans have this really odd pattern where we are just as aggressive as chimpanzees between groups, but we've somehow separated our aggression so that our within group aggression is incredibly minimal compared to chimpanzees. And that may have something to do with the fact that human aggression relies on cooperation and strong social bonds. And so you want to be really nice to your within group friends so that they don't defect when they're on this raid. So what is our answer for whether or not humans are naturally aggressive or naturally peaceful? Well, it's complicated, and I think the answer depends on what kind of aggression we're talking about. And the data that I have shown is that we seem to actually be fairly aggressive when we're talking about between group aggression. We show very similar patterns to chimpanzees with respect to between group aggression. But with respect to within group aggression, we're actually very cooperative and nice to each other. So we have very low rates of within group aggression. Another way of thinking about this is that we are more like chimps when we think about between group aggression, but maybe more like bonobos when we're thinking about within group aggression, when we're thinking about what we do within our own society. Maybe with a little bit less sex, but still the same kind of reduced aggression that we see among bonobos. And so I think that's kind of where I like to stand on this, that we are an interesting species because we have kind of separated out our tendencies for within group and between group aggression, and very few other species have done that. So since this can be a somewhat depressing talk, I don't want to leave you with kind of this idea that humans are doomed to warfare necessarily. I would like to point out that Steve Pinker in his 2011 book did point out that there is a long-term historical trend for reduction in all sorts of types of aggression, war, homicide, torture, all sorts of things. Over time, we have seen this reduction, and that's probably why even through World War I and II, we have these reduced rates of mortality due to warfare, and this is something that is continuing. So even though it may be part of kind of a natural history of warfare that we share with chimpanzees, that doesn't mean that anything is inevitable or that we are doomed to continue high rates of warfare. We certainly have ways of reducing that as we're seeing over time that is declining. So I hope you've learned something about human warfare and chimpanzees from this lecture. I just want to point out that I'm going to be giving another one on a different topic on the Great Ape Extinction Crisis on Thursday, December 7th at noon. I hope you can tune in for that. Not only will I tell you kind of about the threats that are facing all of the great apes, including the orangutans pictured here, but also hopefully give you some ideas for what we can do every day here at Tufts in our everyday lives to try to alleviate this crisis somewhat. So thank you very much. And I just want to say, do we have any questions? If you do have any questions, please type them in the box, and I see that we have two. So the first question is, how do female chimps get adopted into new communities as adults if chimps are so xenophobic? That's a really excellent question. What happens when female chimps seem to be more immune to this kind of intergroup aggression than the males. So if if a group of male chimps is on patrol and they come across a female chimp, they're probably less likely to kill her. They may attack her, but they're probably actually mostly going to try to have sex with her if they can. So they're really actually directing a lot of their aggression towards their rivals, who tend to be males. So female chimps actually face a lot more aggression, not from males in their new community, but from females who are not super keen on sharing food with these new immigrants. And what happens is female chimps the new immigrants will actually spend time with the males in their new community as protectors, because it's the female chimps that tend to our resident female chimps that tend to want to beat them up. And our second question is, how do the chimpanzees know the paternity of the new babies if they're mating with so many females? And the answer is they actually don't know the paternity. They don't know who the father is. One of the risks if you are a female chimpanzee, if you've only had sex with one male and everybody knows it, you run the risk of your baby being killed by any male who knows he's not the father. Because if you have a baby and you're lactating, the chance of you ovulating while you're lactating for a chimpanzee is quite low. So one of the strategies that males will do is kill the baby so that you can start ovulating again and give them a chance at paternity. So a female strategy to avoid that is to mate. A female will mate with every single male in the community and do something that we call confused paternity. So every male has a non-zero chance of being the father, so it would be awfully risky if you killed that baby and it was actually yours. But in general, we don't tend to see that much evidence that they have figured out who their fathers are. These studies haven't been done in great detail, but we haven't seen a lot of bias, from the father's point of view towards particular offspring who are their own. So in general, we think that they are actually completely confused about who the fathers are. So again, I'd like to thank you for joining us on our inaugural faculty webinar, and I hope you can join us in December for our chat about chimpanzee or great ape conservation. Thank you very much.